In the spring of 1519, messengers came running to Tenochtitlan. They brought word of strange towers that floated upon the sea, taller than any temple in the Valley of Mexico. Upon them stood beings with white skins, their bodies sheathed in shining stone. The winds carried their banners, and the water hissed beneath their hulls. The people watched from the beaches, too afraid to draw near. Some said the gods had returned, others whispered it was a vision meant to test the emperor's faith. When the report reached Moctezuma, he was seized by dread. It was said he did not speak for a long time, only lowered his head and trembled. He ordered his priests to search the sacred books and read the omens of the sky. They remembered the prophecies that Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, had sailed east long ago and would one day return from across the sea. Moctezuma sent offerings of gold, cloaks, and feathered ornaments to greet these strangers as gods and learn their purpose. The emissaries who carried these gifts travelled for days to reach the coast. When they saw the newcomers, their hearts faltered. The men wore iron on their faces, and their skins gleamed in the sun. They carried thunder in their hands, and strange deer bore them upon their backs. Their speech was harsh and sharp, like stones striking together. Yet the leader, the one called Cortés, smiled and placed bright glass beads around their necks. He asked many questions through his interpreter, and when the Aztecs offered food and gold, his eyes lingered on the gold. The emissaries returned to Tenochtitlan, filled with confusion and fear. They told of men whose flesh was pale, whose hair grew like straw, and whose animals devoured grass but carried them faster than the wind. They told of thunder that burst from sticks and smoke that filled the air. Moctezuma listened in silence. He would not eat, nor sleep, nor appear in public for days. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "They are gods," he said, "and if they are gods, we must greet them with reverence." So began the gifts: baskets of gold dust, feather shields, jade, and cacao were sent to the strangers. Moctezuma hoped to satisfy them, to keep them at the coast, but each offering only deepened their hunger. Cortés accepted everything with a smile and built his town upon the sand, naming it Veracruz, the True Cross. He sent word back to his king that the land was rich beyond measure, and that its people were ready to serve. From the lakes and causeways of Tenochtitlan, the omens multiplied. Fire lit the night sky. A comet trailed over the city. A mirror in the temple showed visions of armed men advancing through smoke. Women in the marketplaces wailed that the world was ending. The priests climbed the temple stairs and cast incense into the wind. Moctezuma shut himself away, whispering prayers to the gods who no longer answered. When the Spaniards began their march inland, the villages trembled. Some joined them, eager to see their rivals fall. Others fled into the hills. To the Aztecs their weapons were living things, iron serpents that spat fire and bit through shields. The sound of battle rolled through the valleys like thunder. Captives were taken, sacrifices delayed. The balance of the world seemed to shift. At last the strangers reached the valley of Tenochtitlan. They saw the great lake shining under the sun, the city rising from its waters like a vision. Cortés marveled at its bridges, its gardens, and the scent of flowers drifting through the air. The Aztec nobles came forth dressed in cotton robes and jeweled sandals. They bowed, and the two worlds met face to face. When Moctezuma and Cortés stood before each other, the air was still. The emperor wore turquoise and quetzal feathers, his sandals dusted with gold. He spoke with solemn courtesy, welcoming the foreigners to his city and offering them shelter. Cortés stepped forward, took his hand, and said through his interpreter that he came in peace. But his soldiers' eyes moved always toward the temples and their treasures. That night the Aztecs feasted their guests in halls of painted walls and silver cups, yet beneath the music and the incense, fear moved like a shadow. No one could tell if they had welcomed gods or conquerors. In the days that followed, the gifts continued, the prayers multiplied, and the people whispered that the empire had already begun to die. In the bitter cold of the southern seas, Magellan's ships drifted through fog and silence. They had been at sea for months, searching for the strait that would carry them to the Western Ocean. The winds howled through the rigging, and men died of hunger and frostbite. When at last they reached a lonely harbour of ice and wind, they believed no human soul could survive there. Yet one morning, as the mist cleared, they saw a figure standing upon the shore. He was taller than any man they had ever seen. His skin was dark and wind-burned, his hair wild and matted by the sea. He carried a bow as long as a man and wore the skin of a beast upon his shoulders. When he saw the ships, he raised his arms to the sky and let out a cry that echoed across the bay. The sailors froze, thinking they had found a creature from legend, a giant born from the ends of the earth. Magellan ordered that he be approached with care. The men rowed toward the shore, their oars cutting through the cold water. The giant watched them come, unafraid. When they landed, he pointed toward the sky and then toward their faces as if in greeting. The interpreter, trembling, made signs of peace, and the giant smiled, his teeth bright against his weathered face. He led them inland, across the sand and over low hills, swept by wind. They came to a camp of his people, men and women of towering height, dressed in skins, their fires burning low beneath the grey sky. They welcomed the strangers with laughter and curiosity, touching their beards and their armour. The Europeans marvelled at their strength, at the size of their footprints in the mud. Pigafetta, Magellan's chronicler, wrote that they were twice the height of ordinary men, and that their voices were deep as drums. The sailors shared bread, wine, and trinkets of glass. In return, the Patagonians gave them meat, roasted over the fire, and songs that rose and fell with the wind. They danced around the flames, stamping their feet, their shadows long upon the ground. The air was thick with smoke and laughter. For a moment, both peoples looked upon each other not as strangers, but as living proof of how vast the world could be. Yet curiosity soon turned to fear. Magellan wanted to bring two of the giants back to Spain, to show his king the marvels of the world he had discovered. He invited two of them aboard his ship, offering food and drink, and when they slept, he placed irons upon their wrists. When they awoke, they struggled and cried out, their strength shaking the timbers of the vessel. The sailors held them fast, but in the days that followed, the cold and despair consumed them. Both giants died before the fleet left the harbour. The remaining Patagonians vanished into the hills. When the Spaniards searched for them, they found only the ashes of their fires and the sound of wind through the empty plains. Pigafetta gathered a few bones and weapons as proof, claiming them for history. In his journal he wrote of people of prodigious stature who live where the world ends. When the ships finally sailed south again, the men looked back at the desolate coast, at the mountains that seemed to touch the clouds. They wondered whether the giants still watched from the cliffs, unseen and waiting. To the Europeans it was a place of marvels. To the Patagonians it was a place of betrayal. Between them lay only silence, broken by the wind that never ceased. Long after Magellan's death, his chronicler's words would be read in courts and taverns across Europe. The tale of the giants of Patagonia spread like fire, passed from mouth to mouth, reshaped by imagination and distance. Some said they were spirits, others said demons. But for those who had seen them in the flesh, towering figures against the pale sky, it was proof that the world was far larger and far stranger than they had ever believed. In the late summer of 1543, a storm swept across the South China Sea. A small Chinese junk, driven far from its course, found shelter on the shores of an island called Tanegashima, a place unknown to the men who stood upon its deck. Among them were 3 foreigners from the edge of the world, men with pale faces, dressed in worn coats of wool and leather, their eyes the colour of the sea. They were Portuguese traders, cast adrift by the wind, and now they had come upon a land no European had ever seen. The villagers who found them stared in awe. The strangers' speech was harsh and flowing, filled with sounds no one could imitate. Their beards were thick, their hair curled like coiled rope, and their clothes smelled of the ocean. At first, the islanders thought they were shipwrecked barbarians. But when one of the Portuguese unwrapped a long iron weapon from a cloth, a matchlock gun, and fired it into the air, the sound tore across the cliffs like thunder. The people fell to their knees, thinking the heavens had split open. The lord of the island, Tanegashima Tokitaka, soon arrived. He was young, curious, and brave. The strangers bowed clumsily, offering gifts of cloth, mirrors, and trinkets of coloured glass. Through gestures and signs, they explained the weapon they carried, a tube that spat fire and smoke, striking its target from far away. The Lord demanded a demonstration, and when the musket roared again, a bird fell lifeless from the sky. The silence that followed was filled with wonder. Tokitaka ordered that the foreigners be treated with honour. He brought them to his home, fed them rice and fish, and questioned them for hours. The Portuguese tried to describe their distant kingdom, their king, and the endless sea that surrounded the world. They spoke of lands where the sun rose and fell upon different faces, of priests who served a single god, and of ships that crossed oceans wider than any empire. The Japanese listened, unable to tell if these were truths or tales. The Lord purchased one of the muskets and commanded his smiths to copy it. They worked for months, melting and hammering iron, studying the weapon's secret. But when they failed to make the powder spark, the Portuguese showed them the use of the serpentine match, a simple cord of flame that set the charge alight. When the first Japanese-made musket fired, the island shook with applause. It was said that from that moment, the art of war in Japan began to change. As the weeks passed, the strangers learned to eat with chopsticks, to bow before entering a house, to sleep upon mats instead of hammocks. They walked through rice fields and forests of cedar, where the air smelled of rain and smoke. Children followed them, laughing as they stumbled through the narrow paths. The islanders grew used to their presence, and trade blossomed between them, silk for silver, gunpowder for gold, curiosity for curiosity. Yet beneath the peace, unease lingered. The Portuguese spoke often of their god and their king, of the need to bring faith to every shore. They drew the sign of the cross in the sand, and though the Japanese did not understand its meaning, some felt its power. Word spread beyond the island, reaching the lords of Kyushu and the court of Kyoto, that men from across the sea had arrived, men who carried fire in their hands and new gods in their hearts. When the foreigners finally departed, the people gathered on the shore to watch their ship vanish into the horizon. The smoke of their muskets lingered in the air like the memory of thunder. Tokitaka kept the weapons they had sold him and ordered his craftsmen to perfect them. Within a generation, muskets would echo across Japan's fields and castles, reshaping the course of its wars. Centuries later, the story of that meeting would still be told, of the day when wind and chance brought two worlds together. To the Portuguese, it was the beginning of trade and faith in a new empire of the East. To the Japanese, it was the moment the outside world first revealed its power, and the sound of that gunfire marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. In the spring of 1769, a great canoe with white wings appeared off the coast of Te Ika a Maui, the North Island of Aotearoa. The people of Turanganui watched from the cliffs as the strange vessel drifted closer, its sails gleaming in the sun like the feathers of a giant bird. None among them had seen such a thing before. Some thought it was a floating island. Others said it must be a god's canoe, come from the realm of the dead. The air was calm and heavy, and every sound of the surf seemed to whisper of an omen. The people of the land were the Rongohakata, whose ancestors had sailed to these islands long before memory. Their chiefs gathered on the shore and sent messengers inland. When the ship anchored and small boats began to row toward the bay, the elders debated what should be done. Some urged peace and curiosity. Others, wary of old prophecies, said that spirits from across the sea would bring sorrow and change. Still, they decided to meet the strangers, not with fear, but with dignity. From the ship, the captain watched the shore with his telescope. His name was James Cook, and this was his first voyage through the Pacific under the flag of Britain. The men beside him whispered of danger, for only days before they had sailed through unknown reefs and winds. They saw the fires of the Maori villages along the coast and wondered whether the people were friend or foe. Cook ordered gifts to be prepared, beads, cloth, and nails, hoping to show goodwill. Yet among his crew, the muskets were kept ready. When the first meeting took place on the sand, the air trembled with tension. The Maori advanced in formation, armed with long spears and clubs of stone. Their faces were painted with deep black spirals that seemed to move when they shouted their war cries. Cook's men, startled, raised their weapons. The first musket fire cracked across the water, and one of the young Maori fell. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. The people on the shore withdrew, carrying the body of their kin. The strangers remained, unsure if peace was still possible. That night, the ship's journal recorded a most unfortunate beginning. Yet from the cliffs above, the Maori remembered it differently. They spoke of lightning that came from a stick, of thunder without clouds, and of men whose skin was pale as driftwood. The elders said that the spirits of the dead had returned, armed with fire. For many nights afterward, they lit sacred fires to calm the ancestors and to ask what these events foretold. The next morning, Cook sent his Tahitian interpreter ashore to speak words of peace. The Maori listened warily. They brought food and water, and slowly, with gestures and song, a fragile understanding began to form. The British offered iron nails, knives, and mirrors, things that gleamed and cut like nothing the islanders had seen before. In return, the Maori brought fish, cloaks woven of flax, and feathers of the huia bird. Each side studied the other as if looking into a mirror of another world. The journals of the British sailors described their astonishment at the people's strength and the order of their villages. They wrote of carved houses guarded by wooden ancestors with staring eyes, and of warriors who moved in perfect rhythm, stamping their feet in the dust. The Maori, in turn, spoke of men who came in floating mountains, who cooked their food in pots of shining stone, and who carried thunder in their hands. Yet beneath the wonder ran a slow current of unease. The land had never seen such power, and power never comes without a price. In the days that followed, Cook's crew explored the coast, mapping the bays and collecting specimens. Some of the Maori followed them, curious and bold, while others kept their distance. A few traded food for iron, others tested the strangers' strength with their taiaha and were answered with gunfire. The fragile bridge between the two worlds cracked under fear and misunderstanding. Still, the encounters left memories that would outlive both sides. Songs, carvings, and stories of the men who sailed from the horizon. When Cook finally sailed away, the people watched from the hills until his ship vanished beyond the headland. They stood in silence as the great white sails dwindled into mist. In the villages, the elders gathered the young and spoke of what they had seen. Some said the gods had sent the strangers to test them. Others said they were men like any other, clever, restless, and hungry for land. But all agreed that the world had changed. The ancestors' words had come true. The people from beyond the sea had arrived. Years later, when other ships followed, whalers, traders, and soldiers, the descendants of those who had first seen Cook would remember that morning on the sand. They would remember the gunfire, the mirrors, the iron, and the gifts, and they would say that in that moment, two peoples looked upon each other not as enemies or allies, but as two halves of a story that neither could yet understand. The tide had turned, and history had begun to move in a new direction, one that would carry both nations towards sorrow and greatness alike. The year was 1824, and the shores of Natal were quiet beneath the southern sun. The sea rolled against the sand in slow rhythm, and from the forested hills came the sound of drums. On that coast, a handful of British traders had built their huts and raised their flag, believing they had reached a land of opportunity and peace. Yet beyond those dunes stretched a kingdom unlike any they had known, the realm of the Zulu, ruled by a man whose name was already legend, Shaka Kasenzanga Kona. The first encounters were cautious. The traders, led by Henry Francis Finn, had come to barter ivory, hides and beads for cloth, metal and gunpowder. They had heard tales of the Zulu's strength, of warriors who could run all day without food or rest, and of regiments that moved with the precision of a single heartbeat. When Finn's party first saw them, emerging from the tall grass like shadows, they stood in silence. The men wore cowhide shields and short stabbing spears, and the sun flashed along the blades. They moved with the calm of those who feared nothing. Finn wrote that the first meeting took place by the mouth of the Umangeni River. He and his men approached with gifts and gestures of respect, following the customs they had learned from the coastal peoples. The Zulu watched in stillness, their eyes sharp and unreadable. Only when the interpreter spoke of peace and trade did their leader step forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered with ornaments of ivory and brass. His bearing was that of one who commanded both loyalty and terror. When he spoke, his voice was low and deliberate, and his men struck their shields in salute. Finn and his companions were brought before Shaka himself some days later, in the royal kraal inland. They passed through rows of warriors who stood like statues, their spears upright, their heads crowned with feathers. The king sat beneath the shade of a great tree, surrounded by his advisors. His gaze was piercing, his posture absolute. Finn described him as majestic in motion, yet terrible in repose. The traders presented their gifts, cloth of bright colour, knives and beads, and Shaka received them with a slow nod, as though measuring their worth against the lives of men. To the Zulu, these pale visitors were unlike any who had come before. They brought iron that did not bend, guns that spoke thunder, and speech that came through strange clicks of the tongue. Yet they also showed courage, walking unarmed among thousands of warriors. Shaka, who prized bravery above all virtues, found this worthy of respect. He ordered that they be given food and shelter. In return, he demanded service, not as slaves, but as witnesses. They were to heal his wounds, write his words, and observe the might of the Zulu nation. Finn became both guest and captive. He watched as Shaka drilled his regiments upon the plain, their ranks rising and falling like waves. The king would stand in silence, then signal with a motion of his spear, and the formation would shift in perfect order. He spoke of his dream to unite all the lands between the two great rivers, to bring peace through conquest. The British listened and nodded, though they understood little of the world he envisioned. They saw power where he saw unity, savagery where he saw law. The distance between them was wider than any sea. One day Finn saved Shaka's life after an attack by a rival chief. The wound was deep, and while the king's attendants hesitated, Finn cleaned and bound it with medicines from his chest. Shaka survived, and from that day he called the Englishman "my white brother." Finn wrote that Shaka could be generous one moment and merciless the next, laughing with his guests in the morning, executing a regiment at sunset. To live in his court was to stand at the edge of a storm, beautiful, terrifying, and vast. When the British ships returned to the coast months later, Shaka sent gifts aboard: ivory tusks, leopard skins, and cattle. He spoke of friendship between his people and the king across the sea. Yet already the shadow of empire stretched across the horizon. Other traders came, then soldiers, missionaries, and settlers. The Zulu watched as their world began to change. Iron and gunpowder multiplied faster than words of peace could keep pace. The first seeds of betrayal were sown not with blood, but with parchment and trade. Finn would later write of that first meeting as if it were a dream, a time when two powers, equal in pride but divided by purpose, stood face to face. He remembered the morning light over the grasslands, the sound of drums, and the eyes of a king who seemed carved from stone. "We thought ourselves explorers," he wrote, "but it was we who were being measured." In the silence that followed those first greetings, the fate of a continent had begun to turn. In the years that followed, Shaka's empire rose to its greatest height, then fell to treachery and invasion. Finn left the land he had once called home and carried with him the memory of that meeting at Port Natal, the day when the Zulu and the British first spoke across the gulf of history. Long after both men were gone, the echoes of their words would remain, carried by the wind that still moves through the grasslands, whispering of a time when the world was vast enough for wonder and the future still unwritten.